Hi, everybody. This is Steve Maggi from SMA Law Firm. Welcome to Building the Bridge. And I have the honor and privilege of being today with Andrew Hughes, who's an insurance broker with the Alliance Insurance Group based here in St. Pete, Florida. Thank you for joining us, Andrew.
Yeah, my pleasure.
So we both have the pleasure of working with international companies. I know you have a specialization in working with multinationals and all sorts of verticals, and so do I. And so I wanted to ask you the most basic question, which was so important, which is pre-move stage, right? What should people know about insurance and when they're setting up before they launch their US operations?
Well, I think one of the most important things to realize about US insurance, if you're coming from overseas, is that it is not the same nationally. So essentially, insurance in the US is governed by each state separately. So you have 50 different insurance organizations that are dictating the rules for each state. So your workers' compensation insurance is going to be different state by state. What companies are available to you, because they have to be filed with the states and be licensed with each individual state, can vary from state to state. So making sure that the broker you're dealing with actually has a license to be able to work in that state and the insurance contracts to be able to give a varied option around what you are doing in that state. And so really doing that due diligence beforehand to make sure that the broker is licensed in that area. And if you're going to be working in multiple states, make sure that that broker has the licenses across all of those states, because one example is New York City is a very difficult insurance marketplace. So a lot of brokers won't carry a license there just because it's a pain to deal with that state regulations. And then the final thing is that insurance in the US is generally quite a bit more expensive than it is in other countries because of the fact that we are a more litigious society. The liability insurance can be much, much higher. And the workers' compensation, which in Europe is generally handled by the national governments in terms of worker care, they're going to be paying that instead of the additional tax they would pay to the government. So it's going to be more expensive than what a lot of people are anticipating when they come to the US for insurance.
Now, a lot of companies will set up a headquarters, let's say, or they'll incorporate in Delaware, but then they'll want to do business in Florida. They'll set up an office. Does this pertain to just where people have physical offices, or does it pertain to where they're doing business, for example?
So it always applies when you have a physical office there.
Okay.
If you are providing services, so if you're sending employees into a state, then it will apply in that state as well. If they are just purchasing from other states from your facility, say located in Florida, then you do not have to have separate policies for those states where they're buying.
Okay. And if people are working, let's say virtually now, I know your company has people in Colorado and in other states, and including you in Florida. Does that also apply to companies that are launching here where they might be hiring employees virtually, or does that?
So if they are working virtually within the US, the company will still need to provide workers' compensation insurance for them.
Okay. Right. So it doesn't matter where they are. People coming from other countries, especially Europe, like you mentioned, they might have one scheme for their whole country, even though they have lots of provinces. What advice would you give people in terms of planning when they're balancing, where to set up in terms of costs, in terms of taxation, and also the insurance, like bringing the insurance aspect of that, making sure that they're covered, and obviously for all contingencies, right? You hear the horror stories about companies setting up in the Mississippi Delta and they didn't have the right insurance and it didn't cover floods or didn't cover hurricanes or whatever it might be, right? So
correct.
How do they balance that?
So really what I recommend is bringing in a broker on the design stage. So when you're planning that out, I would recommend contacting a broker, being able to run all those eventualities, possibilities by them so they can say, and they're not going to tell you whether you should or shouldn't do it. They're just going to give you the associated cost. So, okay, if we're doing these operations for this specific type of industry in Mississippi, for example, it might be 20% more expensive than if we were doing the same operations in Texas.
Right. Yeah, I think this is what we always preach, right? For companies that are thinking of launching or entrepreneurs is plan as far ahead in advance as possible and make sure that you bring in all these different factors, including insurance, into your budgeting. Because what you don't want to do is run out of money when you're bootstrapping, and then when you get to the US, oops, we didn't have a policy in place, when many times it's required, but it's also, it's a way of covering yourself, right? To make sure that you don't end up going bankrupt because something happened that you weren't insured for.
Correct. And one other thing that I always try and tell my clients is it's a best practice to put your various advisors in contact with each other, so that if you're getting different advice from your accountant versus your insurance broker, if they're talking to each other, they can oftentimes talk out the issues that are coming up between them and then come together and bring you a simplified explanation, instead of the client always having to be the middle person to bounce all the different questions back and forth between the groups.
Yeah, it's already overwhelming enough to start a business in a new country, but when you have to then manage the people that are supposedly helping you, it doesn't make any sense. So I think it's a wonderful point. So how does someone get in touch with you if they're starting to think about launching US operations and they want to make sure that the insurance is part of that calculation?
Sure, I'm always happy to consult. Probably the best way to reach me is by email.
Okay, and we have your email here on the bottom under you. So thank you so much for your time, Andrew, and for your knowledge. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.